The conference room was an ocean of tension. The polished mahogany table reflected the overhead lights in a distorted shimmer, casting an almost sinister glow over the grim faces gathered around it. General Klaus Höfler sat stiffly at the head of the table, his iron-gray uniform pristine, his expression a mask of control. Yet his knuckles were white as they gripped the armrests of his chair, betraying the storm within. In the air hung the acrid scent of cigarette smoke and fear. The Americans had requested this meeting under the guise of diplomatic transparency. But to the Germans, it felt more like a psychological game. What did the Allies gain from inviting their sworn enemies to witness a supposed operational briefing? What were they hiding? The room fell silent as the doors creaked open. A tall American officer strode in, his uniform crisp, his demeanor calm but authoritative. General Walter Stroud was the embodiment of confidence. Beside him, Lieutenant Colonel Henry Price carried a thick leather-bound dossier that seemed to radiate weight, literal and metaphorical. Stroud didn't waste time with pleasantries. He surveyed the room with sharp blue eyes, then spoke, his voice clipped and deliberate. "Gentlemen, you are here today because history demands it. What we are about to disclose will reshape your understanding of the battlefield. This is not an act of kindness. Consider it a warning." Klaus's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The other German officers exchanged uneasy glances. A warning? The idea unsettled them more than outright hostility. Price placed the dossier on the table and flipped it open. Inside were maps, photographs, and a series of neatly typed reports. The first image Price held up was a reconnaissance photograph of the French coastline. It was grainy but unmistakable, hundreds of ships amassed along the English Channel. "Operation Overlord," Stroud announced, letting the name hang in the air like a thunderclap. "You've undoubtedly heard whispers. Now you'll see the reality." The Germans leaned forward, their skepticism giving way to reluctant curiosity. Price began detailing the logistics: troop deployments, naval support, aerial bombardments. His voice was steady, almost clinical, as he outlined a plan so audacious it bordered on madness. "Over 156,000 troops will land on Normandy's beaches in a single day," Price said, his tone betraying neither pride nor fear. "They will be supported by over 5,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, and an unrelenting supply chain." Klaus felt his chest tighten. The scale was unimaginable. He'd expected a raid, a feint to test the Atlantic Wall's defenses. But this? This was an invasion of biblical proportions. "What's your angle here?" Colonel Dietrich Schaefer demanded, his voice sharp. "Why show us this? To intimidate us? To gloat?" Stroud's lips twitched in what might have been a smirk. "To prepare you. You see, the Normandy landings are not the apex of our strategy. They are merely the opening move." Before anyone could process the implication, Price pulled out another document. This one bore a single word stamped in red: "Confidential." He unfolded it to reveal a detailed map of Germany itself, criss-crossed with arrows and symbols indicating future operations. "What you're witnessing is the first domino," Stroud explained. "The landings will shatter your coastal defenses. But our endgame lies far beyond the beaches." The room erupted in murmurs. Klaus's mind raced. Could this be a bluff? A ploy to sow confusion? But the level of detail, the precision of the plans, it was either the most elaborate ruse he'd ever seen or a horrifying glimpse into the Allies' capabilities. "And what of your casualties?" Major Hans Wohler asked, his tone skeptical. "Such an operation would bleed your forces dry." Stroud's expression darkened. "Make no mistake, Major. We are prepared to pay the price. The question is, are you prepared to face the consequences?" The words landed like a hammer blow. The Germans had always prided themselves on their discipline, their unyielding resolve. But this was something else entirely. A willingness to sacrifice on such a scale was both admirable and terrifying. As the Americans continued their briefing, detailing contingency plans and potential countermeasures, Klaus felt a growing sense of unease. He'd always believed in the Reich's superiority, in the invincibility of its defenses. But now, that belief was cracking under the weight of cold, hard evidence. Then came the final blow. Price retrieved a small device from his briefcase and placed it on the table. It was a portable projector. The room dimmed as the first slide illuminated the far wall. It showed a beach littered with obstacles, barbed wire, concrete bunkers, and tight-tank hedgehogs. Overlaid were annotations in precise, blocky handwriting. "This," Price said, "is Omaha Beach. The most heavily fortified of the landing zones. We estimate a 70% casualty rate for the first wave." There was an audible gasp. Even the stoic Klaus couldn't hide his shock. 70%? And yet they were still proceeding? Why? He found himself asking aloud. Why throw so many lives away for a single stretch of coastline? Stroud's gaze locked onto his, unflinching. Because victory is not optional, General. And because the price of failure is far greater than the cost of courage. The room fell silent. For the first time, Klaus felt a pang of doubt. Not in his loyalty, but in the inevitability of Germany's triumph. The Americans weren't just fighting a war, they were fighting for an ideal, something intangible but undeniably powerful. Just as the tension reached its peak, Stroud leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "And now, gentlemen, we come to the part that should truly concern you." He gestured for Price to reveal the final document. It was a timetable, not just for the invasion, but for the weeks and months that would follow. Each line item detailed a relentless march toward Berlin, culminating in an operation codenamed Thunderstrike. "This is not just about Normandy," Stroud said, his voice chillingly calm. "This is about dismantling the Third Reich piece by piece, until there's nothing left but ashes." The weight of his words hung in the air, suffocating and undeniable. The German officers sat frozen, their minds racing with the implications. They'd come into this room expecting propaganda or deception. Instead, they'd been handed a grim forecast of their own destruction. As the Americans gathered their materials and prepared to leave, Stroud offered a final remark, his tone laced with quiet menace. "You still have time to reconsider your choices. But make no mistake, time is running out." With that, he and Price exited, leaving the Germans to grapple with the horrifying reality they'd just witnessed. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the projector still casting its ominous glow. Klaus stared at the empty doorway, his thoughts a chaotic storm. For the first time in his career, he felt the icy grip of fear, not just for himself, but for everything he'd sworn to protect. And then, as if on cue, the projector flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of Klaus's shallow breathing. The war was far from over, but in that moment, it felt as though the end had already begun. The days that followed the briefing were a maelstrom of activity, both on the surface and beneath it. The German High Command convened emergency meetings, their agendas filled with frantic strategies to counteract what they now realized was an unstoppable tidal wave of Allied forces. Klaus Höfler was at the center of it all, his mind divided between professional duty and the nagging dread that had taken root after the American disclosure. On paper, the Atlantic Wall was a formidable defense, pillboxes armed with heavy machine guns, anti-aircraft batteries strategically placed along key choke points, and mines scattered across the beaches like deadly confetti. Yet Klaus knew better than most that the wall's strength was also its Achilles heel. The static nature of their defenses made them vulnerable to the kind of dynamic, overwhelming assault the Americans had outlined. The first indication that the Allies weren't bluffing came 3 days after the briefing. A squadron of American B-17 bombers roared over the German-occupied coast, their payloads painting the beaches with craters. It wasn't a full-scale assault, more of a probing attack. But it sent shockwaves through the German ranks, confirming the scale of what was to come. "We must fortify the inland positions," Klaus urged during one of the heated strategy sessions. "If we focus solely on the beaches, we'll lose the war before it truly begins." "Nonsense," retorted General Wolfgang Brandt, a bullish man whose faith in the Reich's superiority bordered on delusion. "The Atlantic Wall is impenetrable. Let them come. We'll crush them on the sand." And if they bypass the wall? Klaus countered, his voice rising. If they establish a beachhead, our forces will be isolated, cut off from reinforcements. We'll be handing them the keys to France. The room erupted in argument, voices overlapping in a cacophony of fear and bravado. Klaus could feel the tension tightening like a noose. He knew he was right, but convincing his peers was a battle unto itself. They were too blinded by hubris to see the storm bearing down on them. Then came the report that shattered any remaining illusions. Allied intelligence had intercepted a German communiqué, revealing that the Americans had successfully planted misinformation about the true location of the invasion. The High Command had been preparing for an assault on Calais, not Normandy. They've outmaneuvered us before the first shot has even been fired, Klaus muttered to himself as he studied the intercepted documents. The realization was a bitter pill to swallow. The Americans weren't just throwing men and machines at the problem. They were waging a war of the mind, turning Germany's own arrogance against it. Late one night, unable to sleep, Klaus found himself staring out over the channel from an observation post near Cherbourg. The sea was deceptively calm, its surface shimmering under the pale light of the moon. But somewhere beyond that horizon, an armada was assembling. It was an almost poetic contrast, the stillness before the storm. As he stood there, lost in thought, a messenger approached, his face pale and drawn. "Her General, we've received an urgent report. A convoy of Allied ships has been spotted heading south. It could be a feint, but—" Klaus didn't need him to finish. The invasion had begun. The storm unleashed by the Allied invasion battered the German forces with unrelenting ferocity. The reports flooding into General Klaus Höfler's command posts were grim, painting a picture of chaos and desperation. The Atlantic Wall, which had been heralded as an impenetrable shield, was crumbling under the sheer force of Operation Overlord. Smoke billowed across the beaches of Normandy, mingling with the acrid stench of gunpowder and charred metal. The Allied forces had established multiple beachheads, and the Germans' once cohesive defenses were now fragmented pockets of resistance, struggling to hold their ground against an enemy that seemed unstoppable. Klaus stood over a table littered with maps, his fingers tracing the lines of the front. Every shift in the battle was a dagger to his pride, a testament to the inadequacies of their preparations. He had warned them, pleaded for a more flexible strategy, but his advice had fallen on deaf ears. "General," a harried officer stammered as he burst into the room, his face pale and streaked with dirt. "The Americans have broken through at Omaha. They're advancing inland." Klaus clenched his jaw, his mind racing. "Pull back the reserves from Bayeux and reinforce the line. We cannot let them reach Caen." The officer hesitated, his eyes betraying his doubt. "But Her General, if we weaken Bayeux—" "Do it!" Klaus barked, slamming his fist onto the table. "We hold Caen at all costs. If we lose the city, we lose Normandy." The officer snapped to attention and hurried out, leaving Klaus alone with the weight of his decisions. He knew the cost of his orders. Pulling troops from Bayeux would leave it vulnerable, but he had no choice. The Allies were relentless, and every minute they gained was another nail in the Reich's coffin. Outside, the sound of artillery thundered like an unending storm, shaking the very ground beneath them. Klaus stepped out of the bunker and surveyed the horizon. The sky was a canvas of fire and smoke, the sun obscured by the haze of war. In the distance, he could see the faint outlines of Allied bombers, their payloads falling like deadly rain. "Her General," came a voice from behind him. It was Major Hans Wohler, one of his most trusted officers. "We have intercepted an Allied communication. They're planning a major push towards Saint-Lô." Klaus turned to face him, his expression grim. "Saint-Lô? They're aiming to cut our supply lines." Hans nodded. "If they succeed, we'll be trapped. Our forces in Normandy will be encircled." Klaus's mind raced. The Allied strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. By targeting key logistical hubs, they were systematically dismantling the German war machine. He couldn't let them succeed, but his options were limited. "Send a message to High Command," Klaus ordered. "Request immediate reinforcements." And prepare the 21st Panzer Division for a counterattack. We'll hit them before they can consolidate their position. Hans hesitated. Herr General, the 21st is already stretched thin. If we commit them now, then we commit them, Klaus interrupted, his voice steely. If we don't, there won't be a 21st Division left to save. The major saluted and departed, leaving Klaus to stare out at the horizon once more. The weight of the war was crushing, but he couldn't allow himself to falter. His men were counting on him, and failure was not an option. As the hours dragged on, the battle for Normandy intensified. Klaus received word that the counterattack had begun, the 21st Panzer Division engaging the Allied forces near St. Lo. The fighting was brutal, the losses staggering. Yet, despite their best efforts, the Germans were being pushed back. In the command bunker, the tension was palpable. Officers moved about with a frantic energy, their voices a cacophony of reports and orders. Klaus remained at the center of it all, his mind a whirlwind of calculations and strategies. Herr General, Hans called out as he rushed into the room. We've received confirmation. The British are advancing towards Cannes. They've deployed heavy armor. Klaus's eyes narrowed. The British advance was a dagger aimed at the heart of their defenses. If Cannes fell, it would open the floodgates for the Allies to sweep across Normandy. Redirect all available artillery to Cannes, Klaus commanded, and prepare our forces for urban combat. We'll make them pay for every inch. The hours that followed were a blur of chaos and destruction. The battle for Cannes raged with unparalleled ferocity, the city becoming a charnel house of blood and rubble. Klaus received constant updates, each one more dire than the last. Then, the unthinkable happened. A message arrived from the front lines, delivered by a bloodied and exhausted courier. Herr General, the young soldier gasped, his voice trembling. The British have broken through. Cannes is lost. The words hit Klaus like a physical blow. He staggered back, his vision swimming. Cannes had been their linchpin, the cornerstone of their defense. Without it, Normandy was lost. The room fell silent, the weight of the news suffocating. Klaus took a deep breath, steadying himself. Order a retreat, he said, his voice hollow. Pull our forces back to Falaise. We'll make our stand there. Hans stepped forward, his expression a mixture of sorrow and determination. Herr General, if we retreat now, the Allies will pursue us relentlessly. We may not have another chance to regroup. I know, Klaus replied, his voice heavy. But we have no choice. The war is slipping through our fingers, Major. All we can do now is try to delay the inevitable. As the Germans began their retreat, Klaus couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching the death throes of the Reich. The Allies were unstoppable, their momentum a tidal wave that no amount of German ingenuity or bravery could halt. And yet, even in the face of certain defeat, Klaus knew he had to fight on. For his men, for his country, for whatever sliver of hope remained. The battle for Normandy was over, but the war was far from finished. And as long as he drew breath, Klaus Höfler would not surrender. The retreat to Falaise was a nightmare. German columns stretched for miles, winding through narrow roads and forests as they attempted to regroup. The Allies' relentless air superiority made every mile a death trap. Fighter planes screamed overhead, strafing vehicles and scattering soldiers into the trees. The air was thick with smoke, the screams of the wounded, and the deafening roar of explosions. General Klaus Höfler stood atop a hill overlooking the retreat. His binoculars trembled in his hands as he scanned the chaos below. He had ordered this withdrawal, but seeing it unfold filled him with a deep, gnawing guilt. These men were his responsibility, and he had led them to this. Herr General, Major Hans Wöhler called out, his voice barely audible over the din. The Allies are closing in from the south. They've taken Argentan. Klaus lowered his binoculars, his face a mask of exhaustion. Then they're completing the encirclement, he said quietly. Falaise is becoming a trap. Hans hesitated, his brow furrowed with worry. Should we attempt to break out, sir? If we wait any longer, we'll lose what little cohesion we have left. Klaus finished, nodding. He turned to his officers, who had gathered around him, their faces grim and expectant. "We'll punch through to the east. Gather every remaining tank and artillery piece. We have one chance to break free." The officers saluted and dispersed, their urgency palpable. Klaus watched them go, his mind already racing with the calculations of their next move. The Falaise pocket was tightening, and every second they delayed brought them closer to annihilation. The breakout attempt began under the cover of darkness. German tanks rumbled through the narrow roads, their engines roaring as they pushed towards the thinly held Allied lines. Infantry followed closely, their faces set with grim determination. Klaus rode in the lead tank, his heart pounding with every kilometer they gained. At first, it seemed they might succeed. The Allied positions were stretched thin, their forces focused on sealing the pocket. The German assault caught them off guard, punching through the first line of defenses with surprising ease. But as dawn broke, the Allies regrouped, their artillery raining fire down on the escaping Germans. Klaus's tank was struck by a shell, the explosion ripping through the vehicle and killing the driver instantly. Klaus scrambled out of the burning wreckage, his ears ringing and his vision blurred. Around him, the battlefield was a scene of utter carnage. Tanks lay in smoking ruins, and soldiers fought desperately against overwhelming odds. "Herr General!" Hans appeared at his side, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. "The breakout is faltering. The Allies are bringing in reinforcements." Klaus wiped the soot from his face, his mind racing. "We keep pushing," he said, his voice firm. "Tell the men to hold their ground. Every second we buy allows more of our forces to escape." Hans nodded and disappeared into the chaos. Klaus grabbed a rifle from a fallen soldier and joined the fray, firing at advancing Allied troops. The odds were hopeless, but he fought with a ferocity born of desperation. This wasn't just about survival. It was about giving his men a chance to live. By midday, it was clear the breakout had failed. The Falaise pocket had closed, trapping tens of thousands of German soldiers. Klaus and a small group of survivors had managed to escape into the woods, but the cost had been staggering. The fields around Falaise were littered with the dead, a grim testament to the futility of their efforts. Klaus leaned against a tree, his uniform torn and bloodied. His body ached, and his spirit felt crushed under the weight of defeat. Hans sat nearby, his head in his hands. "What now, Herr General?" Hans asked, his voice barely a whisper. Klaus didn't answer immediately. He stared out at the horizon, where columns of smoke rose into the sky. The Reich was crumbling, its armies shattered, its leaders deluded by fantasies of victory. But Klaus still had his men, the ones who had survived. He couldn't abandon them. "We regroup," he said finally, his voice heavy with resolve. "We find the remnants of our forces and fight another day. The war isn't over yet." Hans looked at him, a glimmer of hope returning to his eyes. "Do you believe we can still win?" Klaus shook his head slowly. "No, Hans. But we can survive. And sometimes, that's the only victory left." In the weeks that followed, Klaus and his men moved through the countryside, evading Allied patrols and gathering stragglers. They became ghosts, a shadow of the once mighty Wehrmacht. Klaus knew their days were numbered, but he clung to the belief that as long as they drew breath, there was still a chance to make a difference, to protect the innocent, to resist tyranny, to salvage what little humanity remained in a world consumed by war. And so, as the sun set on the battlefield of Normandy, Klaus Höfler made a silent vow. He would fight not for the Reich, but for the men who followed him, for the ideals they had been forced to abandon, and for a future where war might one day be nothing more than a distant memory. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the Normandy countryside in hues of crimson and gold. General Klaus Höfler sat beneath a shattered oak tree, his uniform torn and stained, his eyes hollow from the weight of what he had witnessed. Around him, the remnants of his men, a few dozen weary, bloodied soldiers, gathered silently, their faces etched with exhaustion and grief. The fields around them bore silent testimony to the cost of their failure, craters, scorched earth, and the lifeless forms of comrades who had given everything. For days they had moved like shadows through the forests and back roads, evading Allied patrols. Each night brought whispers of surrender, of laying down arms and accepting the inevitable. But Klaus couldn't bring himself to give the order. Not yet. He still clung to a sliver of purpose, though it grew fainter with each passing hour. Her general, Major Hans Wohler, approached, his voice low but steady. "The men are asking what comes next." Klaus glanced at the soldiers around him, their eyes filled with a mixture of trust and desperation. He took a deep breath, the cool night air doing little to soothe the turmoil within. "What comes next?" Klaus began, his voice rasping with fatigue. "Is survival. The war, as we knew it, is over. We've lost Normandy, and with it, the Reich's foothold in the West. But that does not mean our lives are over." Hans frowned, his brow furrowed. "Are you suggesting we surrender?" Klaus shook his head. "Not yet. If we surrender now, we lose any chance of helping the innocent who are still caught in this madness. There are civilians trapped in the chaos, displaced families who need protection. We may no longer be able to fight for victory, but we can still fight for them." The men listened intently, their weariness momentarily overshadowed by the flicker of a new purpose. For years, they had fought for orders handed down from an unyielding command structure. Now, Klaus was offering them something different, a chance to act on their own terms, to find meaning beyond the carnage. "What if the Allies find us?" another soldier asked. "They'll treat us as prisoners." Klaus nodded. "Perhaps. But if we face them as men of honor, protecting those who cannot protect themselves, perhaps we will be remembered for more than just the uniform we wore. Perhaps we will find redemption in the eyes of history." For a moment, silence enveloped the group. Then Hans stepped forward, his expression resolute. "I'll follow you, Herr General. Wherever this path leads." One by one, the other soldiers echoed his sentiment, their voices low but unwavering. Klaus felt a swell of emotion rise within him. These men, battered and broken, were choosing to stand with him not out of obligation, but out of belief. The following days marked the beginning of a new chapter. Klaus and his men moved through the countryside, offering aid to civilians displaced by the fighting. They guided families to safety, shared what rations they had, and buried the dead with quiet reverence. Each act of kindness was a small rebellion against the darkness that had consumed Europe. Eventually, the group encountered an Allied patrol. The soldiers raised their hands in surrender, but Klaus stepped forward, his head held high. "We are not here to fight," he said firmly. "We are here to help." The Allied commander, a grizzled British officer, studied Klaus with a wary gaze. After a tense moment, he nodded. "Then perhaps there's hope for you yet." Klaus and his men were taken as prisoners, but their story did not end there. In the months that followed, their acts of compassion and bravery reached the ears of the Allied leadership. Klaus was eventually allowed to testify about the futility of the war and the humanity that could still emerge from its ashes. As the war drew to its inevitable close, Klaus found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this point. The Reich had fallen, but in its place, a fragile new world was being built. And though he bore the scars of the past, Klaus chose to believe in the possibility of a better future, a future shaped not by hatred and division, but by the simple, enduring power of hope.